So actually, I don't think we've spoken about when I was a teenager, what like the kind of trajectory that I went through. So I grew up in India, and uh, around the time when I was 12, I went to boarding school. This boarding school was one of the leading boarding schools um, in India, and it's called the Doon School. It's situated in the northern part of India, in just where the Himalayas begin. And so I spent 6 years uh, in this boarding school, which is modeled on the British public education system. So if any of you are from the UK um, and are familiar with Eton, which is a leading school where most of the past few prime ministers from the United Kingdom have come. So the school that I went to is called the Eton of India. Um, I think it was a very, very formative experience and shaped who I have become. It was hyper competitive. It was an all boys boarding school. So there's this, um, in school to be able to, gain respect, as they say, especially when you're in boarding school and you're not kind of going back home. It was all about sports. Academics at some level was my last priority. I spent a big part of my childhood playing a lot of squash, playing a lot of tennis, a lot of cricket, football, um, and formed great friendships. A lot of the people that I grew up with, in some way or another, I have worked with them in formal or informal capacities. And I think the biggest gift that that period gave me was lifelong friendship, and that that bond, that brotherhood, that no matter how many mistakes you make, you have certain people that will always have your back. So after school finished at 18, I moved to Singapore and spent 10 years living in Singapore, initially for university. And again, I think that hyper competitiveness that was instilled in school never kind of went away. So whether it was, academics or, some of the extracurricular stuff. So a huge movie buff. I was heavily involved. I was the president of the film society, was involved in 20 different things in school, in university, and then obviously played a bunch of sports in university as well, primarily squash and tennis. um, and then started work when I graduated from university in 2013. My first job was a really, really boring, kind of mind-numbing job at this company called PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is kind of like an auditing accounting firm. And within the first 6 months, I knew that that is not what I wanted to do. So I spent the next year trying to figure a way to get out of PwC. Um, and then my second job was it was a little bit more dynamic. So there was a lot more travel involved. I was, doing management consulting for the banking industry, but also worked quite a bit with, some of the fintechs in Southeast Asia. Um, but again, within kind of 6 months of that, well, not 6 months, I think I would say, 12 to 15 months, I knew that it was still a very, very kind of, hierarchical structure. Things were moving slow in the banking industry. And, this is what, when Marcelo introduced these, talked about the podcast. So what I did in, towards the end of 2016, what I'd been doing throughout was kind of every extra, I'd been making very good money as a consultant. And so I took every extra dollar that I had and made real estate investments along with my parents. And so in 2016, I had one liquidity event where I came into a little bit of money. And so then I had to decide what to do with this money. And at that time, it's like, when you're in university, you don't know better, right? So you look at what other people around, and I guess it might be a little bit different for you guys, because just by virtue of the fact that you're on this call, I think you're kind of already ahead of your peers. I wish I had, I had attended, or I had known of sessions like these where, people would come and share about their experiences. Um, but essentially, I kind of just went with the herd initially. Of when I was in university, everyone wanted to become a banker or consultant, and those things didn't work out for me. So I ended up working at this accounting firm, and then went into consulting. So it was basically, I didn't know what to do, and so I just kind of did what I thought was cool, or what everyone else was doing. But over a period of time, I realized that I didn't want to kind of and Martin spoke about thinking long term. One of the big influences in my life has been this guy called Gary Vaynerchuk. I don't know how many of you actually know about him, but he's this very successful businessman, creates a lot of content, especially for young people, and he was the one who kind of um, you know I guess gave me the courage to be like, screw it, just quit that that 9 to 6 job, and create content, do your thing. So Martin, again, I think I was trying to draw parallels with what Martin was trying to talk about, but he was talking about storytelling, and I think that's where the podcast came in for me as well. So in 2016, I'd been making investments. Through 2017, my investments did well enough that I felt that I could, I had that financial freedom on my own to be able to quit my job. And so in 2017, I quit my job and was kind of, I would say, like fun employed for like 6 months, where I was, basically just, working out and reading a bunch of stuff. And what happened during those 6 months was also what I do in my life in general is, make lists, to-do lists, in terms of like things that need to be done on a daily basis, weekly. And then there are these big items that I want to achieve on a, you know, on a macro basis, on like a 1 year, 5 year, 10 year time scale. And so podcast was one of those things. I'd always been fascinated by people who would host podcasts. And initially, the podcast that I wanted to start, that I still want to do, which I haven't done, is just interview extremely interesting and successful people. So interview people like Marcelo, who, by the way, when we first met, himself claimed that he's one of the most interesting people in the world, which is, I really respect that. That confidence, and I think that that mission of wanting to live an interesting life, because there's too many people that just go down that beaten path of doing what everyone else is doing, and not basically thinking for themselves. So the podcast started instead of interviewing very successful people at that time, because I'd been making so many investments in the crypto industry. Decided to use the podcast to create a network within the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. So started interviewing different kinds of stakeholders within that industry. So people like entrepreneurs, VCs, fund managers, people who run cryptocurrency exchanges, lawyers, regulators, anyone and everyone who is or was relevant in the industry. And so I was doing it on a weekly basis. It took a lot of energy, but it was a great, one of the best things that I have ever decided to do. It didn't take, all it took was my kind of time and effort and energy, but there was not big monetary investment involved. But I think in terms of the returns that I got, in terms of helping me to build that brand, helping me to create that network, was very, very powerful. And then using the podcast, started writing for some publications like Tech in Asia, which is the equivalent of TechCrunch for some of you that may not know. And that led to, so Kenrick, who is the through whom I met Marcelo, actually heard one of the podcasts that I did, and basically messaged me to say that he wanted to catch up. And while we were catching up, he told me that he was in the process of setting up this crypto fund, which was going to be like the baby fund of a much larger, VC fund. And basically I in that first meeting itself, I asked him to allow me to help him build that fund. Basically asked him for a job on the spot, because I was unemployed at that time, or fun employed, as I like to call it. And so, I think that he agreed very quickly, and within 2 weeks, I, joined the fund. And then, the fund was a fascinating experience, in terms of building it up from scratch, all the way from, the website itself and what the mission and vision of the fund was, to some of the details, like what should be the time horizon of the fund, working with lawyers, tax advisors, auditors, fund administrators, the local regulator, all these different stakeholders that you need to work with to get a fund going. And I was not that old also at that point. I was 25, 26 when started building this fund as the first employee. And then after doing all that administrative stuff with these different stakeholders, was involved in fundraising, and then meeting a bunch of entrepreneurs, trying to figure out which companies to invest in, and also speaking at multiple conferences. And again, that helped me understand the finance aspect of it. So one of the things that I spoke about, and there are a few people that have influenced me significantly, who mostly actually people from the internet. So one was Gary Vaynerchuk, who I've actually met in real life, and kind of told him the story about how he inspired me, and how a lot of the principles that he lives by, I have tried to incorporate in my life. One of them being a long-term thinker, and being very patient. In the short term, being extremely impatient, but in the long term, being very patient. Which is like, he calls it micro impatience, macro patience. And the second was Naval, who talked about capital, media, and technology. So today, I think, if I'm sure, since you guys are here, I'm presuming you want to be extremely successful, or at least, do interesting things with your life. And so one of the things that, Naval talks about is leverage. And this concept of leverage is, very difficult to understand. I remember, my parents giving me this book called, and I'm sure, I don't know if your parents would have, but it's obviously definitely powerful, which is called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So Rich Dad, Poor Dad, they talk about leverage as well. We only have 24 hours in a day. So how do you leverage up your time, so that even when you're sleeping, for example, at least in that book, they talk about how, assets is the way to kind of grow rich. Over a period of time, I think those concepts are still alive, but have changed a little bit. So today we have kind of 3 kinds of leverages available. And this is how I've thought about, making decisions in my career as well. And so media, capital, and technology are the 3 levers. So in my case, I started with media, with the podcast. So the podcast was a leverage. Instead of me doing 10 calls a day and speaking to 10 people a day, I could do 1 podcast a week, and 400 people would listen to my podcast. And in essence, I would be able to leverage my time in a quicker way to reach out to a greater number of people. And so, and that leverage can be built not just through podcasts. It can be, done through, tweeting about something you're passionate about, or, putting pictures on Instagram about something you're passionate about. So I think, and that's what, Martin was talking about as well, in terms of storytelling. But this is storytelling in action, where instead of just telling the story, what you're doing is actually building an audience And your interests will evolve over a period of time as well. But I think in today's age, especially, um, anything that you're passionate about, I would really encourage everyone to create some content. It doesn't have to be anything intellectual. It can be anything. It could be about, because especially today, there's a market for everything, even if it's very niche. You could just be tweeting about basketball, if that's what you're passionate about, or like Pokemon cards, if that's what you're passionate about. I mean, it could be anything. It has to be something, but something that you're truly passionate about, because then you'll do it in the long term. So for me, the podcast and writing on different publications was the media aspect, and that was one leverage. Then second leverage was capital, which is what um, was at the fund, at the VC fund. So I could invest the $200,000 that I have, or the $500,000 that I have, and try to get returns on those investments, or invest $10 million of other people's money, and take a certain percentage of that and make money on that. So that's the second way of leveraging up your life, so that the decisions that you're making, whether it's 500K or 10 million, in a lot of situations, the decisions could be potentially similar, but at 10 million, your decisions are being implemented at scale. So that was the second leverage. So media, capital. And then now, in terms of my transition outside of the VC fund and into building products, the third leverage is technology. Today, truly, you build a product, that's the true leverage today. Gmail can be used by, 1 million people, 10 million people, or 1 billion people. The product essentially remains the same. Slack, Snapchat, Facebook, all these products, they can be used by a very small group of people or a very large group of people, outside of just adding a few servers on the back end. The product, essentially, in terms of you spending the time to build that product, doesn't change. And so that is the true lever that exists in today's society. One of the other levers that I haven't talked about is, which is a function of capital, is human capital, which is, again, your time is limited. You can only work 10, 12 hours a day. So how do you leverage that up? That is through, getting capital to then acquire human capital, in terms of employing people who can do the work for you. And so I think, high level, what I would do is kind of, I'm not sure how easy or difficult of a concept this is to follow, but I wish someone had told me about this concept when I was younger, in terms of, because, I think especially when you're young, I mean, at least like what I wanted to do was just, like play sports and chase girls, right? And have fun. And, I think this is something I wish I had known a little bit earlier. I would have, not kind of made some of the mistakes I've made. But from my perspective, is more about, now that I look back, I'm still very, very young. So having some sort of mental models in terms of how to make these decisions. And so, I think that's how I want to kind of end it, in terms of, having capital, media, and technology as the three levers in which to maximize some of the potential that one would have. And I think as human beings, we should all try to maximize our potential. No point going to the grave not having maximized your potential. So that's happy to take any questions that you may have. And yeah, thank you for listening.
That's great, Tushar. Thanks so much. I didn't realize that you had such a long career track, background, because you come across as being so young in spirit and
and my face as well, I guess. I don't know.
That is a very good asset to have. When I was 18, I looked like I was 12, and I can tell you that it was not a good thing then. It is a very good thing now. So it's about being very patient in the long term, right?
Absolutely.
So we have 8 minutes until the next speaker. So if you guys want to ask a question, I suggest you ask it a short and quick one. Otherwise, we go on to the continuation of the ice break. So pass back to Sanyan. And any questions to Tushar? And Tushar, of course, you're most welcome to stay with the session if you'd like to see what you're doing and even join some of the activities. But any questions, guys?
I just have a question about the
Yeah.
podcast.
Okay.
So I find podcasts like very interesting because you can learn so many things from it without like seeing people, and you can listen to it anytime. But like, how did you find the ideas you can talk about in podcasts? Because to make like a successful podcast, you need like a lot of different ideas that people find interesting. So how did you generate the ideas?
Sure. So, I mean, that's a very easy question to answer because I didn't generate the ideas. I would interview people who had interesting ideas, and then basically do research beforehand. And then, everyone likes talking about themselves. I love sharing my story right now. And so essentially that's what you do, in a podcast. I mean, if you don't have original ideas, you just speak to other people that have done interesting things or are doing interesting things. And that can be a great way to start.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's we could have one final question and then have at least 5 minutes for the icebreaker.
Yeah, hi. So one part you mentioned was that Gary, if I'm not wrong, convinced you to quit your 9 to 5 job. And especially in like Singapore, we're very, very based in like, oh, you must have like a good job. You must basically like like the culture kind of forces a lot of like fear for failure. So like how do you how did he convince you to quit?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the best questions you could ask. I mean, it's and I was I spent a decade in Singapore. I have since moved back to India, sensing greater opportunities here in the crypto space since last year. But so I'm very familiar with how the Singapore system works, and it's definitely not ideal or modeled for entrepreneurship, and it's once you get stuck in that system, there's that, it's a famous saying that the two biggest drugs in the world, heroin and that monthly paycheck, and so that monthly paycheck definitely becomes very, very difficult. So I think it was what Gary talks about is first of all, I think a couple of things. One is I was in this zone where I was like, oh, I need to make the most amount of money in the shortest possible time. Like, I need to make it right now. And I was like, I mean, I can be very frank. Like at 24, I was making north of $100,000 post taxes, a year, and that's more money that any 24-year-old needs or can spend. You can obviously go crazy, but I mean, from that perspective, having, first of all, having that financial having the financial independence at a very young age helped, because I maximized for that initially. But then what he talks about is not being in a hurry, and I think it goes back to patience. And so he says that literally up until, like, you give yourself a 7 or 10 year window to fail, and I think mentally I'm still in that zone where I've given myself this up until I'm 30 or 32, till you have like other big responsibilities, and until you have other people dependent on you. You just go like, screw it, I'm just going to take all the risks that I can, because I know that's the kind of, first, I think at some level you need to have that self-reflection a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying sit down and like But at some level, you need to reflect in terms of what you think is going to make you happy, right? Is that going to be a 9 to 5, or is that going to be, maybe potentially not being successful in the short to midterm, or potentially the long term as well, but having the potential upside of being extremely successful. And so I was willing to take those odds any day of, giving up something in the short term to win in the long term. And so I think that is something that, I think Singapore as a society doesn't teach. And so I think that's something that I needed someone to tell me, and kind of drill into my brain, that, it's, you just give yourself the bandwidth and the freedom to fail, up until a certain point where you just take like crazy risks. Because when you're I think especially today, when you're super young, you can just start like that again. You can, and today we live in a time where, at some level, and which can be good or bad, that's debatable, but failure is actually celebrated. So I mean, in my head, it is such a blessing to be born in the times that we're born in, where entrepreneurship is celebrated, where access to capital is so easy, where we live in abundance, and we can bounce back so quickly. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but yeah, essentially it's a function of just telling yourself, in your brain that, that life is really long. And at 40, if I didn't take that shot, or at 50, or on my deathbed, if I didn't take that shot or that risk right now, I would definitely be miserable then. And so you're like, screw it, I'm just going to go out on a limb and take that risk. And at some level, that in the short term there's going to be pain, but if you have enough confidence and a belief in your ability, then that you're going to win big as well.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Yeah, you really answered my question. So yeah, I'll take
Yeah.
your advice on giving up
But
things in short term to achieve long term. It's
yeah,
really a good advice.
you should look at his stuff as well. He comes across as like Gary Vaynerchuk, and I can text Marcelo as well, and he can kind of tell you guys about this guy. But I think but he is a little too aggressive, and he's all about the hustle. The few influences in my life, one was Gary, who was like hustle, and do things right now, and work hard, and but still be patient. And then on the other hand, it was this guy called Naval, who's a VC and founder of AngelList in SF, who talked about this concept of capital, media, technology, and leverage. And Naval is on the other end of the spectrum, where he's like, don't work at all, get other people to work for you. And so I kind of married the two, and I think I'm somewhere in the middle, where I work hard as well, but I kind of, and I hustle and like myself, but also get other people to hustle for me. And so, I think, so I've been very privileged to, have been exposed to this content, and, have these influences in my life. But again, the most beautiful part about the internet today is that anyone can, have these influences. Like when I was a teenager, like, I mean, it sounds crazy, but like there was no smartphone. And so you couldn't just like open up YouTube or go on Twitter or Facebook to access the brains of these people. You had to read books, but, I was not much of a reader. But today it's, such a blessing where you can literally pick and, examine the brains of, some of these people who share everything that they have learned in their lives. So I mean, coming from me, it's more of like everything in action, in terms of taking the principles that these guys talk about and putting it into action. But you can kind of directly tap into their brains as well, over a longer period of time, because they create so much content. If I had more time, this is what I want to do in the next 5 to 10 years as well, is to create more content like this myself.